Yeah, good morning. I'll say that again. Good morning. That's better. Yeah, thank you, Tom and the band. That was really brilliant. And I'm going to embarrass somebody now. You can't really see her. I can just see the top of her head behind the sound desk. Amelia came into her dad this morning full of panic. Dad, the song list is enormous. And Adam just said, yeah, Tom's not quite sure which songs he's going to choose. You'll just have to listen. Well, I think she did a brilliant job. Really good. Let's embarrass her a bit more. Sorry, Amelia, you'll have to forgive me. Okay, so we're beginning. Last week we began this series in the Beatitudes. And this week we're going on to the second one of those in Matthew chapter 5, verse 4, where Jesus said this: "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Andy gave us a couple of definitions of blessed last week, and I've got a couple here. One is made happy, another is highly favoured, i.e. by God's grace. I also looked in a different version of the Bible, and there's a version called, or not a version, an edition called the Amplified Bible, which adds a little bit in parenthesis to explain passages that might not be quite clear. And I've taken an extract of the verse from the Amplified, and it reads like this: "Blessed and enviably happy, brackets, by the experience of God's favour and grace, are those who mourn, close brackets, for they shall be comforted." Enviably happy in mourning. It seems perverse, doesn't it? It just doesn't make sense. But I think it's important for us to realise that Jesus is not saying to his disciples, and therefore to us, that we shouldn't mourn. He's not saying that. Or be happy that we're mourning. He's not saying that either. Look, it's important that we mourn, because it helps us to deal with the loss, whatever loss it is we're mourning, and come to terms with it. And of course, mourning is not necessarily because we've been bereaved, although quite often that's how we think of it. But we mourn for lots of things in life. Broken relationships, which are not dissimilar to someone who's losing someone we love. Loss of a job, loss of health. It could be any number of things. But it's important that we go through that process of mourning, because not grieving properly can lead to serious problems. And it's vitally important that we go through the process. Sadly, my mind went to 3 or 4 people who I know in the past who faced traumatic situations. And whilst I'm not a qualified counsellor, my sense is that they haven't mourned properly, and they're still carrying the grief many years later. And it's a weight on their soul, it's a weight on their heart, and it will blight their lives unless they can actually deal with the problem and mourn the trauma through which they went. I was interested to see, when I did a search, some of the signs that someone's not mourned, not grieved properly. One is not speaking about or acknowledging the loss. And I seem to recollect hearing in the news, several years ago now, that the authorities found a very elderly man in a house whose wife had died some months before, and he just left her in the bed because he couldn't face up to the loss. Another sign is overactivity. Burying yourself in work or spending too much time on something else just to distract and keep your mind focused on something else. Sometimes people begin to isolate themselves, detaching from friends and family. And of course that's really dangerous, because that's the time we need friends and family. Indulging in bad habits, overeating just after Christmas, but undereating, drinking too much, all of these things can be an indication that someone's not grieved properly. And this list is by no means exhaustive. Because a few people turn to God. But sadly, I think most people today in the Western world certainly either think God can't or won't do anything. And they frequently end up blaming him for their sorrow. And I just want to digress at that point and ask this question: how do we, as Jesus' disciples, offer comfort to someone who's mourning? And it's no good me saying, well, I'm not a qualified counsellor, so I can't do it. Leave it to somebody else and just walk off. Because Paul, in his letter to the church at Rome, in chapter 12, verse 15, says this: rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. So that's our mandate from God as disciples. Care for others, even in real times of crisis, perhaps especially in times of crisis. And it's an opportunity for us to show them Jesus if they don't yet know him. Of course, generally, we're not qualified counsellors, so we're only thinking about a very basic, leading people towards Jesus, really, by showing them love. And of course, the first thing they need is time and space to mourn, and perhaps even permission from us to pour out their grief to us if they need to. They need to know that they're free to talk to us if they want, rather than feel they've got to bottle it up because we're not interested or we don't know how to handle it. And I have to say, in my experience, which is not vast, the greatest comfort we can be for someone in sorrow is not doing anything necessarily, but simply being there for them. Being sensitive, being willing to listen, without offering profound words of wisdom or what we might think is wisdom. If they want to talk about their loss, then we just respond naturally, instead of sitting in fear of saying the wrong thing. Sadly, some people just turn away. And I was interested last week, I think, knowing this was coming up, I happened to see on the BBC News app an account by a man whose wife died in her early 40s, and he was left with 3 children between the ages of 8 and 14, I think. And he said, you really find out who your friends are, because he said some people didn't know how to deal with it, so they broke off communication. And that does happen, I know. People just turn away because they are afraid. I was a bit slightly amused because he also said that so many people went up to him and said, how are you feeling? And he said, sometimes I just laughed. How do you think I'm feeling? I've just lost my wife. I'm feeling rubbish. And yet, I'm as guilty as anybody else of, how are you feeling today? You know, if you know someone's grieving and mourning, maybe it's not the right question to ask because you know the answer. Just be there for them. And it's important that we care, even if we can't answer the inevitable question of why did this happen? If you get that question, then just refer them to Adam, and he'll answer it. He's very grateful for that. The truth is, we can't answer it in this life. But that is part of our discipleship. Over the years, I've seen two different kinds of grief. As a manager years ago, I attended funerals of staff members who'd died or their partners had died. And two in particular, and especially one, stick in my mind to this day. This one was in a little tiny Anglican church in Totton. There were a handful of us in the church, and I think only the vicar and I could sing the 23rd Psalm because nobody else knew the tune. And the whole thing was bereft of anything. There was no joy. There was no hope. It was just complete loss. And it was so tragic and so sad. But I contrast that with a funeral I went to in Weymouth, and I hold my hand up and admit my guilt. I drove down there thinking, this will be another one of those Anglican funerals. There'll be no joy, there'll be no hope. And I went in and I recognised the tunes of the songs that were being played came from songs of fellowship. Oh, that's a bit different. And then the vicar got up, and this was a staff member's wife who died. The vicar got up and started to talk about her. And she'd obviously been a real Christian, on fire for the Lord. Vicar, some of you will know him now, came from Weymouth to Ferndale. It was Dick Luther. And I came out of that service really uplifted, because it was, yes, of course there was grief. Yes, of course there was sadness. But there was joy and there was hope. So we have on the one hand a hopeless situation, and on the other one that, despite the grief, has hope. And I guess the question for us this morning is, where's our focus? I think Andy used the phrase last week, it's a question of the heart. And I think this week I would say it's a question of our focus. Where is my focus when I'm in a situation that causes me to mourn? Where do I look for comfort? And Jesus' challenge to his disciples, and therefore to us, is trust me. Trust my Father, even in the most trying of circumstances, because that is what will lead to blessing. And Jesus reinforced this with his disciples shortly before his death. John 14 records these words. Jesus said to them, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." Paul reinforces this in his letter to the Philippian church, where he says, "The peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." Are you struggling to get your head around this, how you can be blessed in a time of grief and mourning? Well, it transcends all understanding. So we can't probably get our minds fully around it. We can't understand it completely because it's outside of our understanding. But we can still know it's true. And this is why Jesus could say, "Blessed are those who mourn," not because of the cause of their mourning, but beyond that immediate grief, there is blessing, as we can find solace in God and as we can point other people towards God, because that's where we find our solace. I'd like to read it in yet another translation, same verse, from the New Living Translation. It says, God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. It's a promise. It's a promise. If we turn to God in those difficult times in life, we will find comfort. It won't come down as a blinding flash, but it will come as we go through that grief process. We will find comfort. So what may sound contradictory or even downright ridiculous is in fact a very profound truth that we can hold on to because it's part of our discipleship. And we're assured by Jesus that in times of grief, God will draw near to us and we will receive comfort. And contrast that again with someone who doesn't know God, has no knowledge of him or doesn't even acknowledge his existence. What hope have they got? That's why Jesus said, I don't give peace as the world does, because that's the only place they can turn. But we can turn to God. What a promise for us to hold on to. And what an opportunity for us to share with others when they face a time of mourning. It's the promise of Jesus to his disciples, because it means we can be truly blessed, and it means that we, in turn, can be a blessing to others. It's a great promise, but that's a great challenge as well, isn't it? Now, I hope none of us in the coming week, month, have to face grief and mourning like that, and I hope none of us have to get involved in a situation where we have to get close to someone and help them. But let's take away from today the assurance that this is a promise which is for us, and it's one that we can put into practice whenever we might need it. I'm not going to say any more about that. But I agreed with Adam yesterday that I'd lead us into the time of communion. And as I started to think about that, I was reminded of something that I'd read many years ago and checked it out. And thanks to Google, was able to confirm it. Let me read from 1 Corinthians 11, some really well-known verses. They've been used before and they'll be used many times again, I'm sure, during our communion. And Paul says this, the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. And when he'd given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this in remembrance of me. This isn't a cup. This is just some wine or juice in a glass. But this is what Jesus picked up. He took the cup. They were celebrating, on the occasion when Jesus said this, they were celebrating the Jewish Passover. And in the time of Jesus, the tradition was that there were 4 special cups to be drunk during that Passover. And the cup which they took after supper, which is the one that Paul refers to here, was known variously as the cup of redemption or the cup of blessing. And I found that was quite interesting because we're talking about the Beatitudes. And because it had those names, it really points to the situation very clearly. We get blessing but there had to be redemption. Adam referred to that in the passage he read in Isaiah. Excuse me. There had to be redemption. And that redemption came when Jesus died on the cross and his body was broken and his blood was shed for you and for me. And because of that, we can know blessing. And I think it's very poignant that Jesus used these symbols from the Passover to introduce the new covenant, and then said, do this in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. We're going to do that now. We go out of the